It is often asked, or argued, perhaps more specifically, that if unjust suffering exists, therefore there cannot exist a God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. The argument goes a little like this. God could have any combination of those two attributes, but he could not be in possession of all three. He could be all-loving and all-knowing, but just not have enough power to stop unjust suffering from occurring. Or God could be all-knowing and all-powerful, but he's just not loving enough to stop unjust suffering. Or he's all-loving and all-powerful, he just doesn't know that it is happening or that it will occur. Now, unfortunately, every single aspect of this so-called philosophical problem is incorrectly conceptualized. We will start at the very beginning. One is what we mean by unjust. From a Catholic perspective, all justice will be satisfied. Normally, what a person is looking at is what a person considers to be just or unjust here in this life alone. They are not taking into consideration that there is a world to come, that there is going to be something after all of this has come to a conclusion. And since God is just, all justice will be satisfied. We may not see it on this side of heaven, for instance, but we will ultimately see it in the general resurrection and the general judgment. All justice will be satisfied. So when it comes to this notion of whether something is just or unjust, are we thinking of something that occurs naturally, such as perhaps one individual has the genetics that allows them to live a very long life, while another person has the genetics that end up taking their life very early, perhaps even as young as a child or infant, and saying that this is a natural injustice, or perhaps it is something that occurs to another human being as a result of the action of another, such as suffering that occurs because of an accident, or worse, on purpose by somebody else. No matter what aspect of this that we begin to look at, it still comes down to that the wrong conception here at this point is that it is being assumed that something is unjust if we do not see justice on this side of heaven. And once again, for the Catholic, this is not the correct conception. We understand that God is just, and therefore all justice will be realized. In the end, everything will be in accordance with the justice of God. The second aspect of this is suffering. It is assumed that suffering is always and everywhere a bad thing. Perhaps they are more hedonistic in their thinking, that perhaps the greatest good of man is to pursue pleasure and avoid pain at all costs. But in the Catholic conception, Christ took on suffering. We do not have a God who is indifferent to our suffering, but rather took suffering upon himself through the incarnation. And through the passion, through this, the scourging at the pillar, and the agony in the garden, and the crowning with thorns, and the carrying of the cross, and the crucifixion, Christ suffered a great deal in his life. So God is very acquainted with the nature of suffering. And upon taking suffering, he infused suffering with redemptive value. He used it to shape and mold human nature, to save us from our sins. And so he also, in taking suffering, not only shapes us by means of the suffering, but shaped suffering itself so that it becomes a tool of our sanctification. So we embrace our suffering. We have an attitude of holy resignation to nature and to the suffering which we incur on the side of heaven. And it is God who gives us sufficient grace to deal with those sufferings. Now, with those two conceptions addressed, we can move on to errors that are thought and concerning God. One is whether or not he could be all-knowing. As I've just demonstrated, God knows that all justice is going to be ultimately fulfilled. And being all just, he will be the cause, the certainty of that being the case. So God also knows that through the suffering, it will be a tool of their sanctification, for directing that individual to their ultimate end, which is the beatific vision. And knowing this, God knows all suffering. He knows the good that he's going to bring from it, and he knows the end goal for which he has infused it with redemptive value in our lives as a tool of sanctification. Second would be, why would it be unloving for God to allow us to suffer if he can bring good out of it, particularly if a greater good will result because of the suffering? As I've already demonstrated through the incarnation of Christ, suffering was taken on as part of the redemption. And additionally, as a result of God infusing suffering with redemptive value, it can actually be a very loving thing for God to permit suffering in the life of an individual because of the nature of suffering under the economy of grace. And third would be that God is indeed all-powerful, in that he orchestrates all of these things according to his will, and that everything will be according to the purpose for which he set out for these things, to bring everything to their ultimate end. And so the entire philosophical so-called problem here is rooted in, or should I say, only works as a problem, so to speak, if you define each of these 5 things in a very specific way. So how you look at what is unjust, how you look at suffering, how you conceptualize all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving is going to shape whether or not you resign to a apparent contradiction, but ultimately results in bad theology. So I hope you enjoyed those reflections today. Next time you hear this so-called philosophical problem, you should be able to break it down and cast the Catholic vision of who God is in relation to human suffering.